Well, welcome everyone to the last talk in this series for the semester. We've had a series of great talks. Most of those recordings are posted on the website. If you have thoughts on how the talk series went this semester and how it could be better in future editions, let us know. Let me know, and we'll try to, evolve the structure of things. But today we're lucky to have Frauke and I understand Steven W will also be contributing. So Frauke is a statistician and also a sociologist. She holds appointments at the University of Maryland and the LMU in Munich, Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and has worked on a variety of questions about how concepts like differential privacy, come into play in analyzing data from the social sciences, and she'll be talking about some of that. Steven has worked on a range of problems in machine learning and at the intersection of privacy and also fairness. He's an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, and so we're really lucky to have the two of them here. And I'll let them take it away.
Perfect. Thank you for inviting us. And my understanding is this is a research seminar. And so the way we are planning to do this talk is really very much in the hope for a conversation. So feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions. We are in the process of solving a puzzle under immense time pressure, which we will see in a moment why that is the case. And with something of, I would say, decent relevance, maybe not as important as the census puzzle that some of us are trying to solve, but it is still significant, I think. So I'm going to give a little bit of intro and then hand it over for some details on the technical side. First to Marie-Lou, one of our graduate students here in Germany, who will soon be heading over to Oxford, and then to Stephen and Terence for sort of the DP privacy attempt of this survey. So what is that survey that I'm talking about? This is a project that I've led over the last 2 years together with colleagues from Carnegie Mellon University. Some of you, although this group probably has no Facebook accounts and appearance, but maybe you do, and in case you do, the odds are high that you saw an invitation to take a survey at the top of your newsfeed on the Facebook platform. We had this project was initiated by the WHO and a lot of public health researchers early on in the pandemic, because they said, we can't wait for official data to come in to see where the pandemic is heading and where the next outbreak happens. Test data and hospitalization data are too slow. Can we do syndromic surveillance? And my understanding is other universities, including those in the Boston area, have done attempts, but many of these attempts were of the kind that you had a website where you could sign up if you have symptoms and what have you. And you can imagine that unprompted, soliciting from whoever happens to come by a website in Boston, that might not be the kind of sample you need to really see how is the pandemic evolving. So these organizations and researchers approached Facebook with this large penetration worldwide, asking if they could field in specific countries surveys that help with this syndromic surveillance. And Facebook did say, like, we would be happy to do that under two conditions. We do the same survey across the entire globe, because otherwise the technicality of it will be too difficult. And we do not want the data. We do not want to collect the data. We need to partner with universities that ingest the data, because if we take it in and we can't give it out again, I mean, that, all the rulings that there are would prevent that. And the goal was to make these data available immediately as they come in next day to public health researchers and policymakers to help with the decision making. The survey data collection, both the US effort, which was led by Carnegie Mellon, and our just won the 2 APO awards for policy impact and innovation. This kind of operation has never been done before, and it ran over 2 years continuously. Every day we selected a cross-sectional sample of active Facebook users that were invited to participate in the survey. And then once they clicked, they would participate, they got transported over to a web survey platform at each of the universities that collected the syndromic data and a few other pieces of information, which I will mention in a moment. And then we provided the data publicly in an aggregated form via an API and microdata via data use agreements. Before I share more on the technical details, a few words about the content of the questionnaire. We almost broke the data collection instrument, this Qualtrics survey platform, because the survey was translated in over 50 languages, and users, respondents could go in and then sort of pick their language and on the fly see the survey in a different language. And these platforms, to my biggest surprise, weren't built for that kind of volume. We had, just to give you a sense of scope, surveyed over 150 million people by now over the course of the 2 years. So that's a lot, probably the biggest survey ever done, I think. But so the survey itself had 5 sections. There was a pretty extensive consent section in which we informed that we would share the data with other researchers, how we would disseminate the data. Then there was this big syndromic surveillance set of questions and questions on social distancing behavior. And that will be interesting later on when we think about sort of privacy or potential privacy implications. There were some questions on mental health, a very, very abbreviated depression scale, some questions on economic insecurity, whether there's been sort of recent changes in food access and things of that nature. And then later on in the pandemic, we added questions on first vaccine intent, so intent to get vaccinated and attitudes towards vaccination, and then actual vaccination itself. The intent to vaccination questions were key later on. These were use cases of the data that we did not anticipate. The UK government used them to, when they had to make quick decision on where they would send access vaccines that weren't used in the UK, they tried to send it to places where the uptake or demand is high and the uptake hasn't been that high yet. And so they, for example, used the data for these purposes. So those were other use cases that weren't anticipated at the beginning. I would say upfront, the design of the instrument is not suited necessarily for estimating point estimates on vaccination rate. There's actually a very nice piece by Charlie Meng and colleagues in Nature criticizing the survey for getting the point estimates wrong. And basically, because of its size, with small standard errors, potentially misleading in its information. But the main purpose and also the main purpose going forward while we're doing this effort that we are presenting here was really to see development in the pandemic. So meaning, yes, it is a biased population. It's only Facebook users in all these countries, but the daily cross-sectional participation in the survey, a lot, plus questions not only on one's own syndrome, but knowing someone who is showing COVID-like illness symptoms, has helped to predict the development of the pandemic quite well. The data collection process itself worked as follows. On the Facebook platform, users were invited to participate. They were assigned a random ID that is unrelated to their Facebook ID. To that ID, there was a weight attached by Facebook. I will talk more about that weight in a moment. The invitation transported folks over to the survey platform where they took the survey. The results of that survey were combined with the weights that Facebook produced, and those are the data then made available afterwards. The link between the weights and the survey on the Facebook side gets broken right thereafter. We noticed this painfully because we did some survey experimentation, and due to some pipelining problems, we didn't know who got which experimental version of the questionnaire. There was no way to trace that back, unfortunately, so we had to redo that all. But that is just as a footnote. On the weights itself, and weights will be something that we want to discuss with you later on, there are two sets of weights here that are estimated jointly and then attached to the data as one weight, which also could be a design flaw to be discussed, footnote here for us. The weight has two components. One is the non-response weight. Facebook calculates the inverse probability of the sampled user to complete the survey, and uses for that self-reported age and gender characteristic as they are on the platform, as well as some other correlates that predict the participation in web surveys on the platform. The reason this is important is because those self-reported, or the platform data that Facebook has is erroneous, and we later on, have, of course, the self-reports from the survey itself. So we have seen indications that there could be a mismatch of this. But by and large, this worked well together with a post-stratification weight, where after the non-response adjustment, there was an additional post-stratification done, a raking procedure to get the responses match the age and education benchmarks, age and gender benchmarks from official sources. In countries like the US, that's easy. We have sources like the American Community Survey. In well-developed countries, the data that they deliver to the UN population divisions are very good. But in many countries and territories, we had to get quite innovative in trying to get updated population estimates at the region 1 level. That was our goal, to give out estimates in the aggregated way at region 1 level, which would be the equivalent to states in the United States. The response rates, just briefly, in these surveys varied a lot over the course of the pandemic. They're in general incredibly low, but not lower than other web surveys of that type, so in the 1% range, but one digit range. But we see this even with surveys that Pew runs. Their phone and web surveys are often in the single digit. So that in itself, not too alarming, just means like a lot of people were exposed to the invitation. What was very interesting is to see is that the participation rates, just like in other surveys early on in the pandemic, were high and sort of mimicked or trailed the waves of the pandemic, right? So the topic salience certainly part of the motivation to participate in the country. Just briefly, more for you to sort of go off and then look at the paper later on. I mentioned earlier that it worked to do this early prediction of the syndromic symptoms and create the surveillance system. This is a paper that the Boston Children's Hospital led an analysis across all the countries, probably difficult to see here on the screen, starting with Spain all the way down to Tanzania. What you see here in each of these color columns is the distribution case density for every day between May and December of 2020. Each main color is the different set of indicators used. The black ones are the later on made available official data, basically benchmark case signals, but those are often only available a week or 2 weeks after the outbreak, right? And so the goal was to find something that does predict that a little earlier, and what the colleagues from Boston Children's demonstrated here with our help was that the combination of one's own COVID symptom and the COVID-like illness in the community, this community CLI indicator in reddish here, the second column, those two together very much help to sort of get the patterns right. And to an extent that, for example, Brazil used this as the main indicator for their decision making, and actually had to rely on that because their health system got hacked. Then the only data available ended up being this large-scale survey that they did. How did they get access, or anyone for that matter? I mentioned we had maps produced, contingency tables. That's another important piece as we discuss sort of privacy implications or challenges here. There have been quite a few contingency tables in which combinations of 2 or 3 variables were displayed. Put out, we had in the aggregated data always applied the rule that there shouldn't be more than that there need to be at least 100 cases in a cell in order for the data to be released. Otherwise, they were suppressed entirely. Researchers from academic and nonprofit institutions were able to request access to the microdata. There were a couple of other design decisions that we made to limit any risk, that could be here. One was, it was only a limited number of demographic questions that we asked. We asked age in 10-year brackets. We asked no question on medical history data, at least in non-US countries or primarily EU. No postal code data, only in the US was that asked, and there's no longitudinal measurement. While people could be sampled repeatedly and participated repeatedly, they would not repeatedly provide answers. We also didn't allow for any chaining questions to pull them into other surveys or whatnot. So now here is the interesting part. It slipped my attention, and for the graduate students in the room, you cannot, there's errors like this happen, and I kick myself for not having seen it, but only a year into this project did we notice that the legal teams had included in the EU consent statement an additional set of sentence, or actually one additional sentence that wasn't in the consent statement for the other countries, which was this last one here. So in general, the consent statement was as follows: in order to ensure that we cannot identify you and to keep your responses confidential, we do not collect your name and any other personal data from you. Published results will be aggregated and will not identify you individually or your responses. You may stop taking the survey at any time and may skip any question that you do not wish to answer. So far, so good. That is what everybody saw. And then there was this question: your responses will be retained for the duration of the study, up to a maximum period of 2 years from the date you completed the survey. So that has passed, you might have noticed, right? And when we launched the survey, and initially this didn't seem dramatic, and I guess even if we saw it, we didn't think much of it because no one thought that pandemic would last that long, and that so many researchers after the fact would want to analyze the results, right? So the question we now have is, how can we, before we end up deleting all of the EU data, create, either useful minimal viable aggregate data, or to be able to distribute, synthetic data that are useful for the type of analyses we do. And when you think of the analyses we want to do, keep in mind that we want to maintain the ability to do analyses over time, right? Our unit of analysis is not so much a person. There's no longitudinal information for a person, but we do have regions within the country over time where policy changes were made, where restrictions were imposed. And of course, it is of great interest to evaluate what worked, what didn't work, how well did it work, and maybe use these data in conjunction with other data sources to do so, right? So the hope is to even, after whatever we do to mitigate the privacy protection here, or to actually, it's not so much that the lawyers say we we have any special EU privacy regulations for a change, but they say, because we promise the respondent your answer will not be retained, that only a synthetic or aggregated version of the data should be retained and everything else should be deleted. The other interesting piece is here that the non-response weights, of course, they vary a lot. Steven will say something to that effect in a moment, because these, there are, of course, subgroups that that might have very low probability to participate in the survey. Most importantly, though, could be this post-stratification weight, which presumably we could do after the fact and recreate it out of the demographic variables we have jointly with the geographic information from the various countries. So we've had a couple of suggestion ideas. I'm not going to talk about this in detail because that's not what we ended up doing. But when I proposed this in February to a subset of people here, Steven was so kind and jumped on board, to see what we can do. And so we've gone down two different roads, his team and we, trying to, alter the data in a way that the original responses aren't retained. And so one obvious, or for a survey methodologist, obvious one is to, reduce the number, the information somewhat that is in the data. So for example, here in a 4-point scale, when we talk to those that actually analyze the data and report on the data, what we've seen that they're mostly interested in, the two extreme categories and maybe not so much on two other categories. And for some variables, we were even able to combine the 4-point scale into, two sets of answers that then are binary. There are quite a few variables that have extreme values, like, the number of people you interacted with yesterday or something of that sort. But what we noticed is that, in particular household size and others, those really extreme values that are rare, they could also be a function of trolls, and we have seen in, some of these variables that non-useful answers were given. And often when that was the case, then non-useful or sensible answers were given in other places as well. So in the yes data, for example, you would see people making up a zip code and, putting, 1,000 people in as the number of their household members and what have you, right? So there's some question on whether this truncation already makes the data better in a way and not just adds this privacy protection. We also looked at all variables that where numbers were reported, to which extent we can round the numbers, and took various forms here, and then combining variables, scales and indices, for example, the number of social distancing attempts one did. There were 5 of them that we asked for, and so we would ask if people have followed these rules, initially voluntary, later on prescribed, which of course then if we count them up from 0 to 5 could lead to the risk of revealing behavior afterwards. So one measure also done to the data was random noise added for the survey date, plus minus 1 day, and some random noise to the weight, and to create some synthetic version of the selected variable. So this is the first piece, and I'm handing it over to Mary-Lou to quickly walk us through this slide and the next, and then you hear from Steven's team what they did to create a DP private synthetic version of the data. Mary-Lou.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So what we did is we also identified a set of variables that we created synthetic versions of. And in this example here, you can see the 3 variables we decided on synthesizing using classification and regression trees. And as you can see in the dark blue shade, you see the distribution of the variable with the observed data set, and in the lighter blue shade, you can see the proportion of the distribution in the variable with the synthetic data set. You might note now that the B5 and the B8 variable have high numbers of missing values. This is simply due to the fact that there was a display logic within the data, so that some respondents only saw a certain question after replying a certain response beforehand. Yeah, and so what did we do in the data? How much did observations really change in the synthetic data compared to observed data? So we had overall 46 different items, and 25 of them were left unchanged, of 21 were modified in some kind of way. The first thing we did is that we aggregated response categories in 11 features, as Frauke showed you before. This included simply aggregating response categories to more broader features. We also created some indices, as Frauke showed, so this included social contexts mainly. This is a little bit tricky though, because there were some items within the questionnaire that we aggregated to indices that indicated that people went out their house and met with, say, 10 people, right? And if you aggregate this, unless a person ticks all of these items, you don't have any issues. However, if a person ticks all items and you know what items went within that index, then you can identify people who broke the law maybe at some point because of what was not allowed at the point where they took the survey within their country to meet, for example, with 10 people. What we also did is that we created synthetic data, as I showed you before, using the synthpop package in R. And lastly, we added random noise. This included adding ±1 day to the survey date, but also adding random noise to the weight.
So overall, we evaluated then how much these steps changed the actual responses. We noticed upfront that there were very few actual duplicates in the response pattern because, of this challenge to keep the week and the state within a country as the unit of observation. If we could do this across all weeks, we would have way more cases with similar patterns, but that's not the case if we try to preserve week as an analytic unit. We only were able to match about 8% with one other observation within the same week, despite all the implementation of the perturbation methods, right? Through these approaches, though, we were able to change the response patterns of roughly 50% of the respondents, which is nowhere nearly none of your information will be retained. So I don't think we meet that consent promise we made. There is, as Mary Lou mentioned, a bit of an issue with the missing values. They can be changed if we impute. But what we definitely can guarantee for everybody is that we change their survey date and weight. So handing it over to Steve, because as you see from our sort of pedestrian attempts, to preserve the wording on not retaining the data, but creating, aggregated, semi-synthesized version of it, did not lead necessarily to the success we hoped for. Steve hopefully has a better success story for this problem. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the intro and background. I guess when I first heard about this problem, I got excited because it felt like the kind of problem that DP synthetic data ought to solve. I guess we are still far from success, but at least the initial results show it's possible. So what we try to do in a nutshell is really trying to create synthetic data with formal DP guarantees. And I guess like many people in this room will know what that means. So we have some maybe preliminary results, and I want to highlight some challenges we face mostly from the non-response rate. So this is, pretty much all the work is done by Terrence, who's maybe on the call. Oh, he's here. Okay. So we mostly focus on data set from June 2020. So roughly a bit less than 1 million records, 41 attributes. So we mostly use an algorithm developed by our group. So it's a paper last year we wrote with Terrence and Giuseppe. It's called GEM. I think it stands for Generated Network with Exponential Mechanism. So there are a couple algorithms from our group. I think this one we're pretty happy about. We really want to tell our friends to try it. But in a nutshell, if you know a little bit about the literature, it's really a efficient implementation of the algorithm like MWAM, but leveraging powerful optimization methods like differentiable optimization methods. The goal here is to generate a synthetic data so that all of the three-way marginal queries, all of these answers will be preserved. So there are lots of queries like this, mostly because if you look at some of these categorical attributes, they actually have more than 2 values, right? So if you take all three-way combinations, and for each combination, you can also enumerate all possibilities to fill out those 3 attributes. There are actually like roughly 5.6 million queries, so lots of queries. And here, I think the algorithm gives pretty good error. I would say, like if you look at if everything is normalized between 0 to 1, the max error is roughly 0.3% for epsilon equals 1, and delta to be 1 over n squared. Okay, so what's the big challenge here? I think the biggest question, I don't know how to think about yet, but there are lots of people smarter than me in this call, is to have to think about some of these weights assigned to each individual role, right? So in principle, so far the experiments doesn't include weights. So we pretend the weights are not there. Every individual row in the data, it's just one person without the weight. So basically this is like the differential privacy 101 setting, like everything divided by n. So you count the number of rows, satisfy some property, divide by n, and that's the number you want to preserve. Okay. But nobody uses this data set this way. Basically, like all the studies that have been using this data will compute statistics, by using the weight, right? So when you compute correlation, you use the weight, right? You think about weighted correlations. So ideally, what we should have been doing is, make sure that the statistic computing on the generated synthetic data set with differential privacy, the statistics should somehow preserve the weighted statistic on the private data, on the original data. But we did not do that. And if you think about this problem, I haven't spent too much time thinking about this yet, but there are two challenges that immediately stand out. One is that the weights are actually kind of complicated. So I was trying to read through the documentation, and maybe Frauke already did a pretty good job introducing it. It's actually a product of 3 different numbers. It's actually the final weight assigned to each row is actually a product of 3 different weights, and 2 of them include the non-response weight we just talked about and the post-stratification weight. And we don't know how they are generated. I think at least the non-response rate are sort of like generated by some kind of internal function, some ML model inside of Facebook or Meta. So to us, it's pretty much like a black box. So we don't know how they're generated. And also they could be extremely large, right? So it's very intuitive that, the non-response weight, which is essentially 1 over the probability of this person showing up in the population, could be, in principle, unbounded. So, and then you also multiply with some other weights together. So these weights can be extremely large, and large weights, inherently are incompatible with the typical differentially private mechanisms. For example, if you want to release some of these statistics using Gaussian mechanisms, maybe like the sensitivity is super high, and Gaussian mechanisms or like exponential mechanisms, these are the subroutines we need to use for generated synthetic data. And I think that maybe people who work with the census data products have already thought about some of these questions, right? So some of our work also touch on ACS data, the American Community Survey data. They also have weights assigned to these microdata. As far as I know, I don't know a very good answer how to address these issues yet. Maybe next slide. Yeah, so to be honest, we don't really have a good solution so far, but there are things we could try. There are resources we can pull. For example, for example, the post-stratification weight is something we could have access to after we generate synthetic data, right? So the post-stratification weights, I don't know too much about it, but Frauke can give you a more detailed background. But I believe you can identify the gender and sex and race information in certain region to identify how likely this person is. And we weight the data row accordingly. So these information are in the data, so you can actually do the reweighting accordingly. So in principle, this is a tool you can use after the synthetic data is generated, or even better, maybe knowing that you have such a function you have access to, can you leverage that in the process of synthetic data generation? I don't know how to do that properly, but it's a tool we can maybe leverage. It's not somewhat of a non-black box compared to the non-response weight. And yeah, so this is something we've been thinking about, and based on that, we can start maybe evaluate some of the utilities. But most of the most likely we will just want to hear like what you guys have any suggestions for us or any ideas, because maybe some of you have thought about this kind of question before.
I should add, anyone who's interested in joining us in this endeavor, I can use more hands for sure. There's 13 versions of this questionnaire, and we only like these measures that I mentioned earlier. Obviously, we have to do wave by wave because the questionnaire changes, and so there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us. All right, so open this up for questions that anyone might have, either on the data infrastructure itself, or on the privacy mitigation, or on the discussions we had with the lawyers.
So I have some questions. Are we? Hi, yeah, we're unmuted. So Frauke, can you tell us again what the time constraints are? So at this point, you're past the 2-year.
Yeah, so we're past the 2-year mark, but it's not that all EU data expire immediately, right? It's for every respondent, it's 2 years after they answered, right? And we had a bit of a soft launch at the end of April. And the first 3 waves of the questionnaire were sort of work in progress. We didn't initially sampled stratified by region. And so far we felt pretty good that it's okay if we lose the first month of data for the EU, but now increasingly we feel the pressure to come up with sort of, okay, this is how we're gonna, distribute the data further, because, we every day, basically internally, we delete the respondents up to that day. And we have updated, so the legal teams that looked at this, they have updated their thinking and allowed us to recreate all the aggregated tables with cell sizes of 25. And I can imagine what you guys are thinking. A, you gave out the microdata to over 80 organizations. B, you have all these tables out there. Someone can reconstruct those microdata, but this is not the real problem we have, right? The real problem we have is, as the data collector, how can we stay true to this pledge to the respondent that we wouldn't retain their individual responses, right? And that's what the lawyers pointed out to me, that you basically contractually with each individual made that promise, and you should alter the data in a way that is sort of true to that promise.
So I guess I had a question about the weights, but I don't want to monopolize. If other people have questions, they should speak up or raise their hands.
One quick question. So suppose you had just taken 1 bit of information from each person. Would you view randomized response on that bit as satisfying the promise?
Yeah, so the lawyer said yes. Because I explained to them the idea of synthetic data and that you basically, you know, from information in the aggregate can recreate individual line microdata, but it's no longer the original response and you wouldn't know who answered what. And they were okay with that, right? They said, yeah, that would be okay. That would be in the spirit of that promise. Yeah.
But at the very beginning, I thought that your language said essentially we're not. So what needs to change between?
So let me go back to the.
Yeah, or maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah. Your
Mhm.
responses will be retained for the duration of the study, right? Up to a maximum period of 2 years.
Right, but at the beginning it says we do
Oh.
not collect name or any other personal data from you, and the published results will not identify you individually or your responses.
Right.
So this was always true.
Correct.
So apparently what's required by the 4th bullet is different than that. So
Correct. So the 4th bullet, the way that, so very good point, Francia, because I thought initially that the lawyers might even say, well, the individual responses as they feed into the aggregates mean that the aggregates also need to be deleted. That they didn't see. You know, they said, no, that we understand the 4th bullet as referring to the microdata. So in an individual responses row, and they feel like that should not longer exist in its original form. Now,
right. So if you did randomized response on for each of those records, that would be fine.
Yes.
And the question is there, I mean, sorry, I don't know which hat I'm wearing, whether I'm wearing my let me help Frauke out of a jam hat or whether I'm wearing a privacy hat. But from the first one,
right.
I don't quite understand the lower bound on how you need to perturb the records in order to satisfy the 4th bullet. What is the minimum you could get away with? Not that I, as a privacy person, would advocate for that, but I want to understand the problem.
Yeah, I don't know either, to be honest. This is sort of, and I think that the lawyers or the UMD integrity people or whatever, you know, group that is that looks at this, they don't know either. I mean, they're looking to us, you know, to make a call and say, this is the right thing to do, you know, and then cross maybe their fingers and hoping that there wouldn't be a lawsuit. I mean, the thing is, like, I feel, speaking to your privacy hat, right? I feel pretty good about these survey results, given the sampling scheme and the, like, I think it is incredibly unlikely that someone could get a hold of the microdata, given they are only out with the data use agreement, and we would change, you know, date. And I mean, it's just, it will be incredibly difficult to identify anyone. And most of the information, to be honest, that was asked is not stable information about an individual. It's changing anyway, right? I mean, it's so symptoms, then you have them not anymore. And, you know, if you can't place yourself when it was answered, then, you know, so I'm not worried, but I, of course, am worried about, you know, serving to what we promised, I guess, you know, and so then the question becomes, to your point, what's the, I wouldn't call it minimum get away with, but minimum where we would feel satisfied that this is now no longer an the response that the respondents provided.
Okay. Thanks.
Adam, I think you had a question to the way. Do you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I think there's some, Ron is adding something.
Oh,
Kennedy
okay.
is,
Yeah.
I don't wants to say it out loud or just.
Ron, do you want to unmute yourself and
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, yes. Hi. Sorry, my video is not working for some reason. But I was just commenting that to Cynthia's questions about what's the minimum, from my lawyer's friends interaction with them, that would say, that's to be determined in court. But the law is clearly not mathematical enough to determine, and there is not enough precedents or common law to determine. So, that would be what the courts would do. In terms of determining exactly where the line comes, right? And I understand that I know about the EU, but in the US, the differences between what companies say and what the law says are pretty far apart. And this is something that has never been litigated, and it's waiting to happen. Try to understand it.
that's reassuring.
Yeah. I know.
I mean, the thing is, let me be clear here, right? The thing is, we could just say, all right, we'll delete the EU microdata, right? Researchers coming after us. I'm sorry, it's really, we are trying to preserve the information value that we could learn from here, right? But yeah, that.
Okay. What about standard synthetic data techniques, like whatever Jerry Ryder does? So not necessarily differentially private, but the pre-DP version.
Yeah, so this is what Mary Lou and I were presenting at the beginning.
Right.
These kind of alteration, that's more in that spirit. And so far, with the changes that we felt sort of comfortable doing, what we noticed is that so the logic we had there was, let's make sure we change every record a little bit, right? It won't be changed entirely, but to some extent, right? And of course, we can drive it further and sort of, impute all the values from the multivariate distribution. I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Right, you learn the distribution and then you just create just draw samples from that.
Yeah, yeah.
So that would be okay from the privacy side, from your perspective, your legal perspective, but not necessarily from the accuracy side, or?
I was wondering exactly. I mean, I mean, but we haven't tried that route fully. I mean, there have been a lot of analyses done with that, and what we're currently working on with, some master students is to sort of redo the analysis with our attempt to synthesize the data to see if, do we even get close? But we're not there yet. Yeah.
So you're not even sure if the not differentially private synthetic data does for you what you want, let alone differentially private synthetic data.
Yeah, correct. This is all work in progress. Yeah.
Right. Wow.
I know. I'm sorry to even bring this up, but maybe for the students, helpful to see how real life sometimes feels.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I had a question about how you're evaluating, like you kind of hinted at this, but I was just maybe hoping to get you to spell it out a little more. Like, what do you have a clear sense of what would be satisfactory in terms of the measures of what the synthetic data is, how representative the synthetic data is of the originals?
So Stephen, maybe you can talk about the evaluations you did so far from the way we conceptualize it. I mean, I want to get at least the same conclusions, right? That's very low.
Oh, so is there, I guess that's my question, like, is there a specific set of analyses you're using in effect as a benchmark here?
That would be the dream, yeah. Or we have, I know Frauke sent me a couple well-known studies. It would be ideal if we can reproduce the same conclusion, quality.
Yeah, so that's why I highlighted, I mean, so there have been, the core studies were those syndromic surveillance surveys, right? That sort of predicted the flow of the pandemic. And, you know, to the extent that we stick to the preserving the weekly data, that's the kind of analysis that we would like to be able to do in the same way. And the you know, some of the other use cases of the data presumably would allow to, you know, to focus on the monthly level, say, you know, like the decisions on school opening and school closing. Well, although, yeah, I would need to look into that, what level of aggregation they used for those kind of analyses. But we have some of those test cases or papers where we use the code to replicate. But I think that wasn't your question on the weights, or you had something on the weights earlier.
I had a question about the weights, but I dropped it in favor of this other question because I was more interested. So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to finish the thought, so you were looking at, during the experiments with DP synthetic data, you were looking at three-way marginals.
Yeah.
Right, what Steven said. But really the thing that is most, but you're kind of using this other set of studies as a, I don't know, like a you know, a holdout of sorts to sort of check at the last minute that what you did is sort of has not lost too much. Is that the right way to think about what's going on?
Yeah.
I guess to add a little bit on that, right? We not only want to preserve a set of well-known studies of science of PNAS papers now, but hopefully in 10 years, people can still reliably use this data to write more papers. So there are papers that haven't been written yet that the synthetic data hopefully can enable.
Yeah, so maybe important also for the students. I mean, there's another angle to this, right? These papers, for most of the world, the data will remain, right? It's just the EU countries, right, that have this issue. But the hope, of course, is to keep those published papers replicable, right? And the authors of these papers, they got all nervous when they realized, oh, gee, you know, I promised I put my data out there, or the data is out there so that people can reproduce what I did, and so that's why we said, you know, we would look into the possibility of reproducing the results. But as Steven pointed out, the reason we're doing this endeavor is because we do hope that the data can be useful in the future.
Right, I understand that. I was, you know, trying to get at like how you're deciding whether or not you've succeeded in general at this task. And I mean, you did answer it at least partly, but I guess, you know, that seems like an important component of the big picture here is sort of like, you know, at the end of the day, if you settle on a synthesis method, you know, how do you decide that, you know, you're done, that this is good enough and you can now, you know, actually go and erase the data and be happy with, feel satisfied that whatever's left is useful, is going to support some reasonable subset of future use cases.
Aloni, you had a question earlier.
Yeah, I think the discussion answered the question mostly.
Okay.
The only question I had, the only remaining piece of the question was when you said syndromic surveillance. So I think it sounds like it was the example that you had before with the colored columns was like that. So each column was like showing you, I guess it was something like the percentage of people in the data in Maryland that have this certain set of symptoms. Is that what those tests look like? I guess the question is, what do those tests look like?
Yeah, they're prediction models of sort of outbreaks or case counts in a specific state at a specific time.
And they're more complicated than like some sort of marginal query?
Yes, they are.
Okay, it's not just like how many people in this region have a certain satisfy some predicate.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Selin.
Yeah, so on the weights, it seems like there's a sense in which someone who has a very large weight attached to them, kind of including them with a high weight seems in some ways inherently incompatible with privacy. So how you have, then you may have one individual or small number of individuals that are kind of, you're trying to upweight them to represent a much larger group, presumably. How important is it to keep those very high weight individuals in the data set, or in the, represented in the synthetic data set?
It's a great question, Salil, and to be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, weight trimming is standard methodology among survey methodologists, because we often would get weights that are way too high and it's unneeded, and then your data don't get robust enough. So weight trimming is like pretty standard, and if not done by the data provider, at the latest at the analyst level, they will do that, and many of the other measures that we did, like, combining the scale answers and things like that, is also stuff that the analyst does anyway, right? So there's a lot of changes to the records that an analyst would do, and that inform, our choices here and where we would sort of change the records. And so I'm with you. I think that, and then to be honest, I'm not even sure how the problem is we cannot right now separate out the post-stratification weight from the non-response adjustment weight. With infinite time, I would have created new post-stratification weights and seen if the analysis with just the post-stratification weight gets us already close to the Facebook generated weight. Because if we could get rid of that Facebook generated weight, that would be even better. Because if anyone has any chance of sort of, a legal case here, it's only because of this tie to Facebook in some form and platform data that could somehow be in the weights, right? Because on the survey participation part, is regulated already differently, right? And so even the data use agreements are two different agreements, one for the survey data and one for the weights. And so, yeah, your point's well taken. Yeah.
And the current weights are already trimmed, right? Like according to the documentation.
That's right.
Okay.
But they're not trimmed enough for the DP synthetic data generation methods to work well. Is that what I gathered from the challenge that you were describing, Stephen?
I believe so. I think they're still big, although I haven't seen the file myself. Terrence could comment on it.
Any further questions? Okay, so if there's no more question, let's thank Frauke, Maria, and Stephen one more, and finish this.
And as I said, if anyone is interested in a summer project, around these data, lots of interesting content work and privacy work and other fun stuff to try. So do let me know.
Thank you, everyone.
Good seeing everyone.
Everyone,
Yeah,
and
this was our last.
Stephen, Terrence, and Mary Lou for the talk. And have a good summer, and we'll see everybody hopefully in the fall.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.